two exceptional speakers today to talk about an issue that, as Greg mentioned, is certainly a hot button one in the ongoing political campaigns in both the United States and in Mexico, and one that, going back even before the signature of the North American Free Trade Agreement, has been central to U.S.-North American relations and central to U.S.-Mexican relations, pardon me, and central to broader patterns of North American regionalization and integration. Our two speakers are absolutely leading experts on this, and we feel very lucky to have them. I should say they are contributors together to a volume that I co-edited with Alan Burson, where they write about the role of migration policy in North America. And that volume, North America 2.0, is available for free via the Woodrow Wilson Center. And so you can check out their chapter there if you'd like to follow up on their discussion today. So our speakers, first, Carlos Heredia has been an associate professor at Selee in Mexico City since 2009, where through no fault of his own, he's my colleague. It's been a pleasure to know Carlos for many years. Amongst many publications, he's the editor of the recent book, The Geopolitical Landscapes of Donald Trump, International Politics and Institutional Characteristics of Mexico-Guatemala Relations, published by Routledge 2022. He served in Mexico's 57th Congress as a member of the Chamber of Deputies. And beyond those aspects of his career, Carlos has worked for some 30 years on issues of migration and development in North America. He's well known and deeply respected amongst civil society organizations in Mexico and beyond. He's a frequent contributor to public debates, again, in Mexico and beyond, as a frequent contributor to El Universal, a major newspaper in Mexico City, in addition to other publications. So a real pleasure to have Carlos with us. Alongside him, his co-author on that chapter, Andrew Selee, who is the president of the Migration Policy Institute. He's the author of, amongst many other things, the book Vanishing Frontiers: The Forces Driving Mexico and the United States Together, published by Public Affairs, a book that I would highly recommend. He was previously the executive vice president of the Woodrow Wilson Center and the founding director of its Mexico Institute. He's currently an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and has also taught at Johns Hopkins and George Washington universities. And he has been also a visiting fellow at the Colegio de Mexico. Like with Carlos, Andrew is just absolutely one of the most respected voices in Washington and in Mexico City, where he now sits in the airport, on migration and on other aspects of U.S.-Mexican relations. So again, just an absolute pleasure to have these two expert speakers with us. They're each going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, I believe, which will leave us with time for questions. So please do go ahead and put your questions in the chat as they go, if you would like, or ask them once they have finished speaking. With that, I'll go ahead and turn over the floor to, I believe, were you going to start, Carlos? We had you muted there. Oops, it doesn't say you're muted, and we heard you just fine a moment ago. Oh, there we go. I think I may have heard something there, Carlos. Oh, no. Well, maybe should we
Can you
pass
hear
to?
me?
Yes, I can hear you just fine. So maybe we'll switch the order
I'll
while
jump in.
Carlos maybe reboots his teams. If you don't mind getting us started, Andrew.
No, I'll do that, and I'll try and be more or less brief, and then let Carlos jump in. Great pleasure to be with Carlos in this conversation. Tom, great to see you. And Greg, thank you so much for giving us this space, and great respect for all the work that Sabatis is doing at Texas A&M University, and I know you guys are doing great things on threat detection prevention, and we've had the pleasure of working with you on some things as well. And good to see my colleague Chad Watson as well. I think is on this call. So let me talk about, when we talk in the United States about immigration. We tend to talk about it as though it's a political issue. That either you believe that if you're a Democrat, the Republicans are going to destroy the world, or if you're a Republican, that the Democrats are destroying the world. I work for a nonpartisan organization that includes a bit of both, and so I'm going to try and talk about, I think, what some of the broader forces that are driving migration and challenge us to rethink how we manage it across North America. And all three countries in North America, Mexico, the United States, and Canada, are facing real pressures in multiple ways. And so I know better the United States and Mexico, though I was just up in Ottawa, and we actually do a lot of work with folks in Canada as well on migration issues. So I know a little bit about that, but I would say it's the part I know the least well, and don't claim to be an expert. But I can tell you all three countries are facing stresses and strains. A lot of this has to do, obviously, with unauthorized migration, but some of it has to do also with challenges in the labor market. So let me say that there are four things that have changed in recent years. And the first one is actually, and this is global, this is not just North America. These are things that are happening around the world that are reshaping migration patterns, but they have very specific patterns in the Western Hemisphere that are affecting North America. The first is changes in demographics and labor markets. We have a set of countries, most countries in the world are growing older. And most developed countries, which includes Canada and the United States, are growing old faster than others. What that means is that we have major labor market demand. Um, and we tend to think about this as sort of a post-COVID reality, the economy restarting, and suddenly there's investment again, and 8 to 10 million jobs are open a month, which is true. But some of this is a hot economy, or at least a hot labor market or a tight labor market. But some of this is actually structural and long term. Some of this is actually the aging of American society, which had started before COVID and has continued on since COVID, and became particularly obvious because it was reinforced by an economy that restarted. And so the U.S. is labor market is in need of workers. There are again 8 to 10 million jobs available a month, and this is for the last 18 months or so. This is likely to continue in the future. I mean, the numbers will go down if the economy goes into a recession, certainly, but we are likely to face a tight labor market over time, one way or the other, just because of the aging of American society. This is a huge pull of attraction for certainly legal workers, but also it explains part of why we're seeing the large number of people coming illegally across the border, because they know they're going to get jobs. And in fact, illegal immigration is particularly sensitive to labor market changes, right? I mean, we actually saw the numbers go down in 2007 before the recession started, right? I mean, early on, because some of the sectors that recently arrived immigrants, particularly those who have no documents, move into, are sectors like construction and hospitality industry that were hit early on. Canada has largely avoided some of the challenges in the labor market because they have had very robust immigration. They don't have a lot of illegal immigration, and so it's never been as controversial an issue in Canada. They've been able to have a human capital policy that brings in people based on skills, although increasingly those skills are not only high skilled, but also specific skills, whether it's dairy workers or people who can work on oil rigs, or things that we would consider less skilled occupations, but still require skills, as well as a lot of temporary workers in agriculture and other sectors of the economy. But they really have managed their immigration system to address skills shortages, That said, they are also now facing a lot of stresses and strains around the housing market, particularly. And there's some facing some stresses and strains simply about the pace of change. Because in Canada, right now, about 1 in every 4 people is foreign-born, and that's changing the composition of society very quickly. And some people love that, some people push back, and so they have their own stresses and strains around immigration as well. But the U.S. is particularly noticeable. In Mexico, this has not yet become terribly visible. Although, if anyone has been into a cafe in Roma or Condesa recently, which are Tony neighborhoods in Mexico City, you will realize that, English is the prevalent language, that if you speak Spanish there, they're going to look at you like you're, falling off and just falling. And I'm glad we can hear Carlos laugh now. So that means he's back with us. People will think that, you've fallen off another planet. I had that experience recently. Mexico is attracting people quality of life reasons, but there's also labor opportunities at high skilled workers. But increasingly, also there's a lot of need in export oriented agriculture, as well as in the service sector in the industrialized areas of northern Mexico. And you can tell that 10 or 15 years from now, Mexico is going to be experiencing its own version of labor market needs. Again, Mexico is a good 20 or 30 years behind the United States and Canada on this, but it is also starting to happen, because it turns out it's not just the developed economies that are growing older. It's also countries like Mexico that are below now the replacement rate in births, and many other, um, upper middle economies and middle economies around the world, Malaysia and Thailand, and many others. The second thing going on, so first thing is changing demographics or changing labor markets, and they're creating attractions, right, for people to go new places. Secondly, or go in larger numbers to the same old places. Second thing going on is we're facing a lot of displacement crises around the world, and a few big ones in the United States, in the Western Hemisphere, that affect the United States. Now, I don't tend to buy the idea that there's more displacement today than ever before, which you'll hear some places. If you look back a few decades, the world was a very savage place, far more savage than it is now, and it's pretty savage today. But we certainly have expanded what it means. People have more ability to cross borders, more on that again in a moment. And we've also expanded our ideas of what it means to be a displaced person. And that's actually a good thing. So in this hemisphere, we're facing, 7.5 million Venezuelans who've left their country since 2010, mostly since 2016. So in less than a decade. Some of them directly politically persecuted by the regime in power, but many of them leaving because the government economic policies collapsed the economy, left people without access to health care and good education and decent wages. Now, in another period, we might not have considered them displaced people, but today we do. We understand them as a population of people that was driven out, and they're mostly living in countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And probably not surprising to us that some of them would eventually started to come north. In fact, I was very surprised a few years ago that we weren't seeing more. You were seeing about 90% of the Venezuelans staying in this hemisphere, but not yet coming to the United States. And so should not surprise us. Eventually, they started heading north. They had made it as far as Mexico, but generally not further until recently. Um, there are other crises going on. Nicaragua, another kleptocracy. Haiti, which is in complete collapse. Cuba, which is also, has been in tough times for a very long time, but in particularly tough times right now. But all of these are going on in our hemisphere in a way that create a push factor for people to get out and move. And we're also becoming increasingly aware that climate affects people in different ways, that there are places where agriculture is becoming unsustainable. And we're increasingly thinking of that as displacement as well. So take that as a second element. First element, labor markets and demography. Second element, displacement. Third has to do with this thing. We're living in a world where technology, communications, transportation have transformed people's ability to move. There was a time when many people facing difficult livelihood choices and even violence and persecution would stay put, or they would move to the closest big city they could get to, or maybe the country next door. People can now think of longer journeys because the world is more connected by flights, also by roads and railroads and boats, but especially by flights. You can get from Africa to Brazil and then think about coming up to the United States, for example. You can get from Central Asia to Istanbul, and from which there are multiple flights around the world. People are connected and they can navigate their way on their own we tend to assume that smugglers have caused this vast mobility, but smugglers, frankly, we can talk more about this when we get to the discussion period. But smugglers are and not to justify smugglers. There certainly are smugglers who have invented routes and smugglers who've been opportunistic and convinced people to move places they would not have moved before. But many of the people moving today are not using a smuggler from point to point. Indeed, most are not using a smuggler from point to point. That's certainly true in the Western Hemisphere. Most people are navigating using WhatsApp, YouTube, GPS, other forms, and they're buying the services of smugglers along the way. Um, People have more agency to conceive longer journeys and to move. And over time, smugglers or a smuggling industry, because not everyone involved is actually a smuggler. In fact, who is a smuggler is somewhat of a. I was having this debate with a colleague who's been trying to figure out the political economy of migration in Central America. And said, I don't know what to call the people, for example, who have motorcycles and are giving people a ride across Honduras. Are they smugglers? And in a sense, they are, but they actually just started off as being people in the local neighborhood where people are crossing who realize that they can make a few bucks giving people a ride. And now they do it. And they do it within their own country. And they don't really ask if people, are they smugglers? Are they not smugglers? Are they just transportation workers? Taxi driver. I got to know a taxi driver at one point on the Guatemala-Mexico border who clearly his main business was transporting migrants to the nearest point where they could cross the border. But it turns out he was also doing some perfectly legal thing. And by the way, that's probably completely legal in Guatemala. But he also was a regular taxi driver for tourists. He was taking me around. He also did a few journeys for people who were doing commerce in the region. Is he a smuggler? Is he not a smuggler? But he's certainly part of the smuggling industry. You have this in the Darien Gap right now. And the Darien Gap has been an enormous game changer for migration in the Western Hemisphere. It was the barrier that made it hard for more than a few thousand very daring people every year to try and think about getting from South America to Central America and then up to Mexico and the United States. That has now changed forever, right? I mean, it is hard to think about how you close down the Darien Gap. We can go to that if people want to talk about it more, because there's a lot of thinking about how you would do that, but it's actually quite complicated. And it's not just that there are smugglers that take you across. There are smugglers on the Colombian side, but on the Panamanian side, actually a lot of this is this sort of para-smuggling industry. People who sell water and food, people who may offer you a ride for a certain part of the journey or a guide services for a certain part of the journey. But it's not traditional smuggling. But there's an incredible infrastructure now built up in the Darien Gap to move people across. And that makes it possible not just for the Venezuelans who are primarily displaced in South America to think about going north, or Ecuadorians who suddenly started to see their country, or at least parts of their country, descend into violence, but also someone from Mauritania or someone from Uzbekistan to think about getting, or someone from China to think about getting to South America and then head north to the United States. The final thing, and with this I will end, but it is a big thing, is that obviously policies have not kept up with the new world we live in. And the fact that policies have not kept up means that we actually have ended up creating incentives for people to move illegally while undermining the possibility of people moving legally. And it is reinforcing the illegal movements we're seeing, the irregular movements we're seeing around the world, and particularly in this hemisphere, and at the same time not meeting some of the labor needs we have. So one of these is, of course, the inability for our labor laws and our labor visas to keep up with actual market needs. So the last time we changed our visa system was 1990. And in 1990, we set a cap of 65,000 with a couple exceptions here and there for H-1B visas, for high-skilled visas, and 66,000 for non-agricultural visas. That was great in 1990. I mean, some people would argue it was too much or too little, but it was a number people could agree on in 1990. Clearly, it doesn't make any sense 34 years later, right? And there are sectors of the economy that depend on immigrant workers, which we know, like home care, where there are no visas available, right? And so we need to actually think about how we create some of the legal pathways that allow people to come, the visa pathways allow people to come legally to meet labor needs, right? Canada has just constantly their visa system. They're clamping back a little bit right now because there's some public pushback, but but we have very little ability to do this. We set everything in legislation in the United States, which makes it very hard. Secondly, we have the ways we try and deter illegal immigration are also, quite ineffective. So, I mean, first, let's start with, in Mexico, just actually on Friday was meeting with the folks at the National Immigration Institute. Happy to talk more about that. I mean, an agency built for another era, underfunded, structured probably the wrong way in a number of aspects. Suddenly trying to deal with a surge in people coming through the country with very little ability to do so, and a country that does not actually have an ability to deport people many places beyond Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, occasionally Cuba and Venezuela, but in limited ways. The United States, we are continuing to fund our border agencies at levels far below what they would need just to be able to process people in a timely way. And then add into this the challenges we're facing in our asylum system. And here I will annoy those of you who think we should have no asylum system and annoy those of you who think we should give asylum to everyone. There's probably a little bit of both in this call. But the reality is the asylum system we have in our country was designed for much smaller flows, for much more limited numbers of people seeking protection. Right now, it is so overwhelmed that almost anyone who says they have a protection need will be able to stay in the country for years on end, at which point it would be very hard, if not impossible, to deport them. This is a huge challenge, right? And look, I'm a strong believer in protection. I think we should do it often and early. I think we should actually be trying to find people with protection needs earlier and in their country, either in their country of origin before they flee or in the country next door. But it is not a great idea when we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of people at the border claiming asylum and have very little ability to make efficient, fair decisions on who is an asylum seeker, who's likely to succeed and who isn't, right? And we do need it. We saw a step towards this in the Senate with a Senate compromise that Senator Langford had led on, where they would have made it just a little bit harder to get asylum. They would have resourced it better, but they would have kept it as a fair and open process. We need to be thinking about how to do this. Canada is in the same position, by the way. Canada's asylum system is crashing. Mexico's asylum system is crashing, although surprisingly, it's still the most efficient of the three. But all three are facing it. And we need to rethink how we do protection. We want to make sure we're protecting people who need protection, but we're not incentivizing people who are coming for economic reasons. And for that, we should be updating our visa policies and allowing people to come legally. So I will leave it there and just say immigration is part of what has made North America successful. It is part of what has built a real engine of regional competitiveness. It is part of what has made the United States in particular an innovative country, as well as Canada. And I think Mexico is beginning to discover, as it's becoming more of an immigrant country, also some of the benefits of immigration. But if we don't manage it well, what we're going to end up with is undermining the potential of bringing in the workers we need and the people we want to become part of American society, Canadian society, and Mexican society, and at the same time creating antibodies against immigration, and a real pushback that then will lead people to do self-destructive things in order to try and close down borders. Carlos, over to you.
Oh, now you've muted yourself, I'm afraid, Carlos. We heard you laughing earlier, but hopefully you're...
Can you hear me now?
There we go. That's perfect.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Tom and Greg and Megan and Texas A&M for the opportunity to talk about these crucial issues. To begin with, I would like to make two general statements, and then I will go into specifics, pretty much like Andrew did. The first general statement is that I am aware that to an increasing extent, migration policy in the United States has become a national security policy. But it has happened to other policies as well. It has happened to trade policy, to energy policy. They're all national security policies. And to the extent that they're national security policies, the temptation is there, the incentives are there for unilateral decisions, rather than making decisions in a regional framework, in a shared responsibility framework that sounds, we hear it in the speeches, in the Los Angeles statement, for instance, but we don't see much of it in practice, which means the incentives are bigger to continue in the framework of unilateral national security decisions from Washington. The second statement is that Mexico has transitioned from several decades in which we saw migration basically having Mexico as a sending country to the United States, and the United States having the challenge of figuring out what to do with those migrants, to a situation in which Mexico has become the one country where most of the people going to the United States want to get to jump across the border to the United States. So, so Mexico is now, of course, continues to be a sending country, but also a country of destination, and mostly a country in transit for flows that come from all corners of the world. So that geopolitical transition that Andrew also outlined is key in understanding what is going on in Mexico regarding migration policy, and how migration policy fits into the bilateral relationship, into the USMCA framework, and into the whole phenomenon of migration and mobility in the Western Hemisphere. So another statement: there has not been a bilateral agreement between Mexico and the United States on migration and mobility since 1965, at the end of the Bracero program, where Mexico supplied manpower to the economy of the United States that needed it during the war, the World War II, and in the aftermath of the war. So is an agreement on mobility and migration in the works? I don't know. I don't see it clearly. A general framework has been discussed in several meetings, including the one I mentioned in Los Angeles, convened by President Biden, that was not attended by President López Obrador. But what we do see, and this is my first point, is that we saw the disappearance of circular migration. For many years, certainly before 9/11, we had migrants come and go. In fact, what we had was labor mobility rather than emigration. People did not change their permanent residence. They could come and go. And for me, it's an ideal situation that I would love to see coming back, although I see it's a very long shot. And the climate in Congress is probably the most hostile than it has ever been, or most hostile in many years, to even begin to discuss a principle or a set of principles for circular labor mobility, and for people to go and work and then go back home to Mexico. So the end of circular migration also meant that in the United States, people who were already inside did not dare going out because they didn't have certainty on whether they could come back in. So once you close the door to the newcomers, you also close the door to those who may have wanted to leave and then come back, but are hesitant about leaving because they don't have any labor stability or any certainty that they will be able to come back. The second point is that the USMCA framework now has a labor chapter. NAFTA did not have a labor chapter. It did have a NAFTA side agreement, but it was not part of the core of the trade pact. Now it is part of the core, except that it has a very deep asymmetry, namely the fact that the agreement does oversee labor rights in Mexico, and there's even a mechanism for rapid response, a rapid response labor mechanism to address situations that may involve violation of labor rights, of collective bargaining, of free affiliation to workers' unions in Mexico to Mexican workers. But there's no reciprocity. I mean, the situation of Mexican agricultural workers, day laborers in the United States, well, first of all, agriculture is excluded, so it's not included in that mechanism. It cannot be addressed through this rapid response labor mechanism. So when we say that North America is vying to become the most competitive region or regional economy in the world, there are some spots in which we still have to work on very basic labor rights and reciprocity, at least between Mexico and the United States. The next point is that, ironically, and my students find that very hard to believe, the three countries of North America are now experiencing labor shortages, Mexico included. I mean, if you look at the labor market from Baja California to Nuevo León, that's pretty much all the border states except for my home state, Tamaulipas. You will find very severe labor shortages in some areas of economic activity, and Mexican workers are being replaced by Central American workers and workers from the Caribbean. So it's become more often that you go into a convenience store in Monterrey or in Tijuana or in Guadalajara or in Mexico City, and you're going to find that the people working there are from Guatemala, Honduras, Haiti, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and so on and so forth. And this is happening very quickly. In fact, it will happen at a deeper pace because Mexico has already made its demographic transition. The two countries that are furthest along in the demographic transition are Mexico and El Salvador. So looking towards the future, you are going to see a sustained flow of Guatemalans and Hondurans, but not as many Salvadorians and Mexico after the end of this decade, because the demographic clock is ticking and the increase in Mexico's population has dramatically slowed down. So we do have labor shortages here that are being compensated with workers from Central America and the Caribbean. And there's one concept that is kind of puzzling for me, and it is the division of the categories of unskilled work, skilled work. Because day laborers from Mexico, agricultural workers from Mexico do work that is grueling, that is extremely harsh, that very difficult, and they have become essential workers, not only because they cannot work remotely, but also because they're irreplaceable. You cannot find manpower that does the long hours under very difficult conditions that Mexican day laborers do in the United States. So, so it's kind of ironic that we speak of North America as the most competitive region in the world, but we have not been able to address that specific niche in which the situation of day laborers do not exactly match those that prevail for local national workers. Now, what is the current political / bilateral situation between the Biden administration and the López Obrador administration. President Biden has sent a number of times, I have lost track of how many times, this woman, Margaret Sherwood Randall, who works in the White House as a national security advisor. And it's obvious that the discussion is focused on national security. Right? Mayorkas has come a number of times and other Homeland Security officials, but they're not basically discussing migration. They're basically discussing national security of the United States, which implies that the number of workers trying to get across the border has to come down in a very dramatic way on the road to the US election in November. And during, I'm sure Andrew has the dates, has the figures up to date on every issue, but the number of workers that have gone across the border in the first 5 months of 2024 has gone dramatically down, at least compared to 2023. And so to a good extent, what has happened at the ground level is good news for the re-election of President Biden. But there are some contrast. There's a sharp contrast when it comes to what is Mexico doing vis-a-vis other workers, the Central America, Caribbean workers. Well, basically, the strategy has been containment through the National Guard military deployment in the two borders, in the southern border and the northern border. So I guess the strategy is always flowing from managing and suppressing the flow of migrants. I don't think that any strategy that bets on the suppression, the permanent suppression of migrant flows will succeed, because many migrants, they overstay their visas or are there for reasons other than having jumped across the border. But the situation that I described at the very beginning, in which there is no common understanding between Mexico and the United States regarding mobility and migration, is still the case. There's dialogue. There are some principles of understanding. Then there's some pressure from Washington on what specifically the president needs Mexico to do. But there's no understanding, no strategic understanding in that regard. And in Mexico, there's I wouldn't say that it's widespread discussion on what should be the quid pro quo. What should Mexico ask the United States to continue doing what some people call the dirty work of immigration containment? What should Mexico ask regarding the flow of arms, the flow of weapons, the southbound flow of weapons, including many that end up in the hands of those that traffic with fentanyl in a northbound traffic? What should Mexico ask in terms of the regularization of the Dreamers at the federal level? What should we be discussing in terms of the modernization of border infrastructure and trade facilitation? And most of all, how do we transition from a situation in which we discuss migration from a national security perspective of suppressing the flows to a program of circular labor mobility, and most of all, agricultural workers and service workers, beyond the current framework of what we have of the U.S. granting H-2A and H-2B visas. There's one more element, and I'll conclude with that, and it's the fact that the China policy of the United States is also a major factor that has not been discussed here because we're not discussing global geopolitics, but to a good extent, it also has a strong bearing on Mexico because Mexico is trying to find out what its role can be in the nearshoring or friendshoring or ally shoring process, and that is a crucial component. And I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Andrew, for those excellent presentations. You've both covered a lot of ground. Hopefully we have some questions brewing. As I said, please do raise your hand or put your question in the chat. While we are waiting for those to percolate, I have many questions, but just to put a couple things on the table. I mean, I think this idea that both of you have alluded to about competing frames, national security versus kind of economic understandings of migration, perhaps more as an opportunity, is really a salient issue. I'm wondering, what kind of opportunities might exist in the near term with this competition, even if it's or with this sort of these competing frames, even if it's not the sort of the whole enchilada. What are the sorts of things where there might be some space for cooperation? You also talked quite a lot about sort of increasing commonalities in North America, aging demographics, labor markets with real needs. And I'm wondering whether, thinking through those commonalities, whether you see any opportunities to perhaps kind of address migration coming northward from Central America and elsewhere in ways that are also more beneficial to Mexico, as opposed to maybe the pressure that is coming through for Mexico to push migration south. And then finally, one of the aging populations, of course, is the migrants themselves. Many longtime migrants, Mexican migrants in the United States, are now approaching or at retirement age. And any thoughts you have on what might be done there, I'd be very curious to hear. We also have a question from Christine Heflin, who asks, what improvements might be put into place through executive action? So are there things that with Congress gridlocked, the Biden administration might be able to do in the near term? So I'll give you both the floor again if you have anything on that, and I'm sure we'll have some other questions as well.
So on Mexico and the US, let me say both countries actually have a strategy. Mexico launched one last week, literally the first strategy I've seen on migration, and the US has one, and the two actually interact quite a bit around these strategies. The problem is actually the ability to carry out what is contained in those strategies, because that turns out to be really hard. So the Mexican strategy has, I believe, 4 elements, if I remember correctly. One is dealing with the diaspora abroad, Mexicans abroad, those that want to return, facilitating remittances, trying to make sure Mexicans continue to feel part of the homeland. As you would expect, a country where 1/10 of the population lives abroad would want to keep in touch with them. So that's one big element, right? There's a second big element around integrating immigrants who want to stay in the country, people who either intended to go to Mexico or were on their way to the US and stayed in Mexico, how to give people legal status and integrate them in the country. And there's a third, I'm going to forget one of the elements. A third one is on irregular migration, figuring out their enforcement strategy around that, as well as their protection strategy through asylum. And the fourth one is about regional engagement. How do they engage with countries in the region? The US strategy, now all of those are hard. Mexico is new to integrating migrants and to thinking about its own visa policies and to has actually been doing a fairly good job on asylum, but is, again, overwhelmed on that account. It has more experience dealing with its diaspora abroad, obviously, and only recently is starting to develop some capacity to figure out border control, but that is still quite incipient, and with agencies that really aren't set up to do that in any sort of clear, transparent, and efficient way. The U.S. strategy, I would say, at least the Biden administration strategy, is also looks beautiful on paper, which is, how do you create more legal pathways for people to come legally? How do you reform the asylum system so that people who need protection get it, but others do not stay in the country for years? And then how do you do some sort of border control, right? And enforcement generally, so people who don't fit into either the protection side or the legal pathways don't stay. None of those, and they've been using executive orders to the question. I mean, they've been using executive orders to try and do all parts of this, but executive orders are inherently fairly weak. So they're contestable in court, of course, but they also, there's only so much you can do with them, right? And you're sort of stretching what the executive has the ability to do without Congress authorizing it, and you're often doing it without resources, right? Which is another real constraint. So to take asylum, they have a circumvention of legal pathways rule, which says that if you cross between ports of entry, you don't go through a regular port, it's going to be a higher standard for asylum. But in fact, they don't really have the resources to put most people through that process. And so most people are still getting released with a notice to appear. They're not actually going through that process at all. So it's worked a little bit, but not very much in changing the asylum system. They've tried to create legal pathways, both by increasing demand for H-2 visas and extending to limit possible the number of people that come on H-2Bs, which are capped, but they have some flexibility to expand it. They have expanded the number from Central America quite a bit, actually. And they've created this thing called CHNV, which is a pathway for parole pathway that allows for work for 2 years for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. And it's worked very well. There are very few Cubans, from a migration management standpoint, Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans, there are very few that cross between ports of entry right now. So it at least did not work as well for Venezuelans, but that legal pathway seemed to have worked for 3 of the 4 nationalities. We can talk more about why if you want to, but beyond that, they have very little ability to create legal pathways. And finally, enforcement. I think we're about to see an executive order to stop taking people in after 4,000. 4,000 people have arrived between ports of entry. I think the Mexican government is not thrilled, but willing to go along with it. But ultimately, unless you have the ability to actually make decisions on who needs protection and return people who don't qualify, it's pretty hard to do. And there are several countries where they can't return people, at least not in large numbers or in some cases at all. Venezuela, China. China will occasionally take people, not often. Nicaragua will occasionally take people, not often. Cuba, same. Venezuela, not at all. And if you only have 11 planes, which is what they've got, right? I mean, actually, resources become a major constraint here as well. So, I think there are real limitations unless Democrats and Republicans get together, reasonable people who are willing to talk to each other and come up with a strategy. It's very hard to do. And in the case of Mexico, I think all of this is still very new, and there's now suddenly a lot of willingness to figure it out, but it's going to be left to a new administration to either pick that up or not.
Thanks. Carlos, would you like to come in on some of those questions as well?
Yes. I will address a couple of the subjects that Andrew raised regarding the so-called Mexican model of migration and labor mobility that was just announced a few days ago. First of all, I need to say that in Mexico, the relevant policy is the one the president implements without even looking at the written policy. So having a written policy does not mean that it will be implemented. And we know that for a fact, we've known that for a fact for a long time. So the president has been very pragmatic in the sense of saying, what do I need to give the United States to appease Washington in exerting pressure on Mexico on non-migration issues like the energy panel, for instance, or fentanyl? It will always be on the picture, but there are other issues, including human rights, where congressional Democrats are very active. And the president will always go for the pragmatic way and say, "Oh, no, 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 that's I don't care about what the written policy says. This is what I need now to deal with the president of the United States, whomever that may be in the White House." A second point is that Mexico has a long habit of demanding from the United States what it does not grant to Central Americans. I mean, is there a Dreamers program for Central American students and youth that live in Mexico? No. Do we give driver's license to Guatemalans? No, we don't. I mean, so we're only beginning to become aware that it cuts both ways. What you demand from the United States, you're ultimately, lo and behold, gonna be not forced, but you're gonna be in a situation in which Central Americans are also demanding that, what you demand from. So there needs to be reciprocity in that regard, because Central Americans will keep coming. That's for sure. And the Mexican economy now can employ hundreds of thousands of Central Americans, given the labor market situation of shortage of workers in Mexico. The asylum system in Mexico is grossly underfunded and understaffed. At some point, I told my American friends that the Mexican Agency for Refugees for 2019, the first year of the López Obrador administration, I told them the yearly budget of the Mexican Agency for Refugees is $2 million. And they would go like, "Did you say 2 billion? No, I said 2 million, $2 million, 40 some million pesos at the time," which was inconceivable, because it only reflected the fact that applications for asylum in Mexico were almost non-existent. And then they jumped very rapidly, and we're getting an average of 150,000, 160,000 per year. And the kind of budget that the agency has, of course, is vastly insufficient. And as for the regular engagement, there's a lot of talk, a lot of rhetoric on how Mexico deals with its Latin American brothers and sister countries, and so on and so forth. But the truth is that when the governments meet, it's the migrants or the asylum seekers that lose, because most likely it will be a series of agreements that relate more to immigration containment by the different countries, including in a conspicuous way Mexico and Guatemala. So as opposed to the Anglo-Saxon tradition, in which the legislation is there to be enforced, in Mexico, the beautiful speeches are there not to be enforced, but only to impress those that still believe that beautiful speeches will turn into actual effective policy.
Great. We have another question from Susan Richards, directed toward Andrew in particular, but it says, "Andrew, you discussed the millions that have arrived and claimed asylum and are slowly working through the process of having their asylum claim considered. Do you have thoughts about how many in the coming years, how many people will likely have a non-meritorious claim and lose their ability to work lawfully, but then do not depart the United States, and how those workers may impact the economy?"
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the huge questions that we struggle with a lot is we've ended up with a massive number of people who are in what we call twilight statuses, and we call them twilight statuses because they are lawfully present in some way, but there's an end date, right? People who have gotten parole through CBP1, which we haven't even talked about, which is a good idea, right? I mean, give people a chance to come to the border in theory to get an asylum, an expedited asylum appointment, though that's not actually happening because of resources. If they don't cross between ports of entry, people who come in the CHNB program who are, authorized to work for 2 years, people who have temporary protected status, and then everyone who's applying for asylum, right? I mean, who are allowed to work, stay and work. They can get a work permit after 9 months and are allowed to stay and work in the country till their asylum case is heard. But if they don't have a meritorious claim, they, are likely not going to self removed from the country. They may get removed, after their hearing, but there's a good chance that they'll find a way of staying, and or they may abscond if they realize they don't have a strong case. I think this is a huge issue. It is frankly, it is a draw, right? People are making a bet often that if they can get in and they can stay for a year or two, the chance of actually getting deported is low. And frankly, despite what you may hear about possibilities of massive deportation, it's very hard to deport people. I mean, I don't know if anyone here is from ICE that's on the call, but you could tell us about this. But just the actual process. I mean, whatever we think of removals and how many there should be, and frankly, as a country, we probably don't want to be removing large numbers of people who are deeply integrated in the economy, right? And in local communities, but even the practicalities of doing it, it's hard to do in large numbers. So people are likely to stay. And I think that does raise a lot of questions about, we were a country where 3% of the population was undocumented. That number is almost certainly going to go up. And it creates all sorts of challenges down the road in figuring out what we do, right? Do you bring people out of the shadows? Probably a good idea after a while, but it becomes a tougher political discussion the larger the numbers are. So yeah, I think I mean, look, I think you're probably sensing this. I'm trying to stay as neutral on this as possible. I think immigration is fabulous for the country. I don't think we would be where we are without it. And I think we need more legal immigration, and we should be investing heavily in that. At the same time, I do worry about the large numbers coming at the border, because I think most Americans perceive there isn't a clear process for deciding who comes in. There's generally support for asylum as long as it's being granted to people who need it. But I think there's a growing sense, if you look at public opinion, most Americans are pro-immigration and very worried about the border. And they're not wrong, right? I mean, when the numbers have gotten to sort of 2 million encounters, 2 million plus encounters, it's on right now. If the current numbers continue, it looks like it might be about 1.5 million, which is a lot less than 2 million, right? Or 2.4 million last year encounters, but it's still a very large number by historical standards. It's not the largest in history. I mean, there were actually early 2000s was higher, but it's a large number. And people in the country both continue to be pro-immigration, but they're also, you start to see an erosion of support because people are concerned about that there's no clear, transparent, fair process at the border for deciding who comes in and what's going to happen to folks.
Carlos, Andrew, thank you so much. We're reaching the end of our time, and really appreciate your contributions today. I just want to give Greg an opportunity to say a last word if he'd like, or Chap, if you had anything to add. I see you. Thanks. So Greg, if you have any last words.
No, again, just join the chorus of thank yous, and just say that we'll let you know when the next distinguished speaker event is going to take place, and just look for the next announcement, hopefully here in June. So Andrew and Carlos, thank you. It was wonderful. And we look forward to continuing to work with both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Greg.